May some saving sense of humor liberate us from arrogance and pompousness, and from thinking ourselves more important than we are. May we make amends if we chance to ridicule others or their views. May we be cured from making war and calling it peace, from special privilege and calling it justice, from indifference and calling it tolerance, from polluting and calling it progress. From all these may we be cured. May it be so.
So for today's Dharma talk, I want to continue our conversation on the 5 precepts. And today I want to talk about sex, and sex being part of the 3rd precept, or the mindfulness training to refrain from misusing sexuality and intimacy. And I'm going to try to share this also on Facebook Live, but I'm running out of batteries, so it's probably not going to last very long. But we'll see what we can do. We'll see how it works. Okay. So, I'm going to talk about sex. And I want to start this Dharma talk on the 3rd precept with a quote from the Buddha, which I think is the heart of this precept. And it's, quote, "One is not called noble who harms living beings. By not harming living beings, one is called noble." End quote. So some of you may be saying, I thought we're going to talk about sex, and you're right, we are. And I want to talk about the Buddhist teaching on sexual ethics and the 3rd precept. And I think it's really important. As many of you know, there have been too many sexual scandals within sangha communities, the place we would last hope to see it happening. And locally, we have our own issues. The history here in Kanzian some years ago. And there's been new revelations at Shambhala, and also Noah Levine at Against the Stream. Now, at Kanzian, it was admitted, and it appears also Shambhala, the teachers have admitted such. And just last year, Noah Levine blamed his fall on the Me Too movement for all of his problems. Our local Roshi first was apologetic and had talked about defrocking for a year to do self-reflection. But both he and Noah Levine felt as if though their teaching was too important for them to stop and step down. I wonder how that made their victims feel. You may say that I'm airing dirty laundry, or that we are, yes, human. And this is true. We are. And at the same time, the 3rd precept is a training precept. It's not about being perfect. But that being said, when one takes on the mantle of a teacher, more is expected. And maybe this happens in our Dharma centers because we remove ourselves too much from the basic ethical teachings of the Buddha. We spend all our time thinking and talking about meditation. But we need to remember mindfulness is a part of the Buddhist practice, not the whole of the Buddhist practice. Sila, or Shila, ethical action, the 5 precepts, the right effort of the Eightfold Path, are prerequisites for fruitful meditation practice. Could it be if we integrated this more as part of our practice and reflection, we could avoid some of the pitfalls that have befell other Dharma centers? I would say yes. But this is nothing new. There have been many accusations and teachers stepping down over the years. It is important to see things as they are. These kind of actions, especially by teachers, can cause great harm to those who they assault, great harm psychologically and spiritually. And I want to go back to that Buddha quote. Quote, one is not called noble who harms living beings. By not harming living beings, one is called noble. End quote. I really think that this quote is the heart of all of the 5 precepts. They're not just about mindfulness. They're not just about certain ethical action. It's all about ethical action of non-harming. For the past few Sundays, we've been talking about Buddhist ethics, specifically the lay precepts, which some of you have taken formally and others integrate into your daily life. Regardless of where you lie on the continuum, they are part of the participation in our community, in our sangha. It's our aspiration for non-harm in all its different forms that unites us more than anything of what we believe individually. From the perspective of Buddhist mindfulness, mindfulness is only one part of the training, part of the path. Simply paying attention on how our mind works doesn't do any good for anybody else. Ethical conduct interweaves what mindfulness and ethical conduct of mindfulness do, and that revolves around this notion of non-harm and respect of other living beings. We can think of taking our ethical behavior as taking our mindfulness practice off of the cushion and into our everyday life, into right now. And so let's look at that from this idea of a healthy, sexually intimate relationship. Now, for those that come from a tradition, a Judeo-Christian tradition probably, that looked at sex as evil, this may trigger you, but Buddhism doesn't look at it that way at all. It was very confusing to me from my previous tradition that one of the greatest sins one could do was a sexual sin, next to the shedding of innocent blood. And for me, that just never made sense. It was, in my personal opinion, kind of ass backward. So I want to start from the very beginning that Buddhist teachings do not look at sex as dirty or sinful, and as many Buddhists there are many opinions about sexual misconduct. Okay? The training is not about having sex. I just want to say that too, unless you're a monastic in some traditions, okay? And it's not about being a good Buddhist or a bad Buddhist. It's about non-harming. And I want to talk more about that, but before I do, I want to give you a little historical, contextual background. It's important to know that not all Buddhists see eye to eye. Many Buddhists hold some very traditional points of view regarding sex, regarding prescriptions on when and who and the opportunity with sex and blah, 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 blah. Even the Dalai Lama has expressed certain views on sexuality that we in our fellowship disagree with, though in his old age he has softened. With great respect to His Holiness, he is not the Pope of Buddhists, but even among other Tibetans, there is a multiplicity of views. Jose Cabezon, who is a scholar for the Dalai Lama Professor of Religious Studies at UC Santa Barbara, has written extensively on sexual ethics within Buddhism. And from his research, over 800 years of sexual misconduct for Buddhists was simply adultery and nothing else. There was no prescription. There was nothing. Now, historically, things started to change. And all of a sudden, there became new prescriptions of who and when and what was appropriate sex. In time, with bans on homosexuality, premarital sex, oral sex, even dirty talk. Really? He had some interesting insight on what sparked the change, but that's for another time. Okay? That is cultural and political. Now, for us, in the West, the context is much different. Our society is drenched in sex, from advertising to free porn, sexual harassment to sex addiction. Even our spiritual leaders can turn out to be sexual predators. There probably has never been such a sex-centric country as ours since the days of Rome. Even in the midst of general cultural puritanism, we love our sex. And maybe it's because we rarely talk about what healthy, open, and non-harming sexuality looks like. Also, how often do we reflect on our own attitudes towards our relationship with sexuality and intimacy, and how it can affect our practice, how it affects our relationships? One of the things that we can do is we can reflect on our intimate and sexual relationships from the perspective of non-harming. And what we want to do is we want to ask ourselves, why do we think it's important to do this as part of our mindfulness practice? Why is it important to think about non-harming? If dukkha, suffering, disease, disappointment, is caused by tanha, craving or thirst for a specific pleasure, how does sexuality relate to this? And a question we can all ask ourselves, has sexual desire caused a discord in your life? I think it would be overly simplistic in a modern context to simply look at the third precept as refraining from sex or adultery only. There are different contexts in which we can engage with this precept. In the time of the Buddha, there was no such thing as the internet and all of the free visual representation of sex that you can find. We need to consider a reality that we are more sexually free than in the time of the Buddha, and that can be healthy, and at times that can be unhealthy. Sexual misconduct that is happening in some American sanghas needs to be addressed by the Buddhist community as a whole. With our more liberal views on sexuality, it's important that we look at some of these from the perspective of non-harm, not simply sexuality, and then hold people accountable for the harming. Here are two very contemporary ways that we can look into some aspects of sexuality. Again, these are non-normative. Some of the things we can ask ourselves is masturbation a habitual act okay as part of our practice? Also, from a Buddhist perspective, what about pornography? Could that be problematic? Again, this is not a normative practice. This is, hey, if you're going to watch porn and masturbate, I don't care. But what we need to do is have that dialogue with ourselves in our engagement with that mindfulness practice as part of the third precept, as a training precept. What is my relationship to these things? In and of itself, pornography is not evil or sinful, and for some, it can actually be therapeutic. From a Buddhist perspective, we may want to ask ourselves, how can we look at this from a non-harm perspective? When we look at pornography, are we seeing another human being subjective, or are we seeing only a manifestation of our desire, our objectification? And who are we harming by the object of our gaze? Are we harming ourselves in seeing another human being as an object? What effect could that have on our practice and our relationships? We learn from the principle of karma that all intentional actions water certain seeds. Seeds of fear, seeds of attachment, seeds of compassion, seeds of liberation. What seeds are we sowing through our sexual relationships? Something to ask ourselves. Something to ask ourselves. And they're not easy questions to ask. I really appreciate Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching on the third precept. And he calls it in the affirmational the precept of true love. And here's part of it. Quote, aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I am committed to cultivating responsibility and learning ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. End quote. This is the spirit of the early teachings of not misusing sexuality. Question, what does this mean to you? What does this mean in your own life? To say we don't have issues with sexuality is just not true. Look at the Me Too movement. Look at the suffering and the trauma that many men and women suffer because of the misuse of sexuality within families, within businesses, within communities. There's no escaping the reality that our practice of the third precept is something we will want to engage with and look at. Thich Nhat Hanh goes on, I am determined not to engage in sexual relations without true love and a deep, long-term commitment made known to my family and friends. End quote. Now, this is interesting, and this is a modern teacher's take on the precepts. That being said, it's interesting that in the earliest Buddhist texts, being in love was not a requirement for appropriate sexuality. So, it's still a personal engagement. And here again, we can engage and reflect on the teaching. For some, this teaching has been vital in their practice and healing. For others, it's not. The teaching can also be seen on how important consent is in a sexual relationship. Quote, again from Thich Nhat Hanh. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. Seeing that body and mind are one, I am committed to learning appropriate ways to take care of my sexual energy and cultivating loving kindness, compassion, joy, and inclusivity, which are the four basic elements of true love for my greater happiness and greater happiness of others. Practicing true love, we know that we will continue beautifully into the future. End quote. Richard Gombrich, one of the foremost scholars on Theravada Buddhism, talks about the precepts are not norms. They're not something to be judged by, but they're more like undertakings, as he says, practices we engage in at all different levels. And the relationship changes as our practice deepens. Now, I want to reiterate that again. The precepts are not commandments. And wherever a person is on the continuum of their practice of the precepts, there is no judgment. Come as you are. At the same time, engagement and reflection on the precepts are part of a holistic mindfulness approach. How often have we contemplated our relationship with eros, with the erotic? I know I have, because I have eros and erotica tattooed on my neck. This is something that is very integral to us as being embodied human beings. It can be one of the most transcendent experiences of our lives and also one of the most wounding. I can almost guarantee you that each of us has work to do with this precept. And maybe not the off the cushion and in the bed part, but in our overall relationship with eros in our everyday life. And here's something I want to emphasize. As householders, as lay people, our relationship with sexuality is very different from the monastic. Thank God. Healthy, caring sexuality is one of the greatest graces and mysteries of being embodied. And for us as lay practitioners, it can be a door to an even greater connectivity, intimacy, and awareness, if we can integrate it as a healthy part of our practice. I think there is something inherent in sexuality that can foster a kind of presence with another human being that is not possible in any other way. But as the old cliche goes about double-edged swords, mindful sex is something we can cultivate, and we are encouraged to cultivate within the container of non-harm, care, and honor of its mystery and transcendence. Remember, as with any training practice, we're going to fail at times until we don't. I fail time and time again, and I still try again. We've talked about this before, that there's something different and unique in our fellowship, and it's part of our precept taking ceremony, where we've added these words, quote, joyfully entrusting in Amida when I fall short and simply start again, end quote. We keep going no matter how much we fail or how many times we have to get up, because Namo Amida Butsu accepts us regardless. It gives me and you the freedom to never feel like we have to give up. I do what I can, not because I have to, but because I want to. This is the ultimate spirit of each of the precepts. I want to aspire to live the noble life of non-harm. I want to end with the same words that I started with from the Buddha himself, that we keep going on and on until that one day each of us can be called by the Buddhas a noble one. Quote, one is not called noble who harms living beings. By not harming living beings, one is called noble. Namo Amida Butsu.